In this segment, I want to talk to you about the theory of government. It's important that we begin a discussion of American government by looking at the very nature of government itself. The first thing to note about government is that it's everywhere. There's no place on the face of this globe where there are not land and people where there isn't government. Even a continent like Antarctica that has no native population has people who are there year-round, research scientists, now tourists visiting there. And in every case, those people who are there are subject to the control of one government or another. And those governments place people in Antarctica under treaties that have been signed among the nations. So even in Antarctica, if there are people there, they are subject to the control of one government or another. Why is that? Governments are not natural phenomena. They're not like storms or earthquakes. They're not like biological realities. Why do we have governments? Well, we have governments for really a very simple reason. We can't protect ourselves when we're asleep. That's the reason for it. To put the argument in its proper historical framework, we might go back to the founding of our country, to a document like the Declaration of Independence that talks about, in the words of Thomas Jefferson in the opening paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, where did that phrase come from? Well, it's traced back logically to a paraphrase of a book by John Locke called The Second Treatise on Government. And that can be traced back at least a few decades before to a work by Thomas Hobbes known as the Leviathan. Basic to all of that is a notion of natural rights. The argument there is that all human beings have a right to self-preservation, based on the fact that there is a law of self-preservation, that living creatures, most particularly Homo sapiens, have a right to preserve themselves, to take steps to guarantee their own survival. The problem is that if there isn't a government, they're in what's called a state of nature. For those in a state of nature, those rights are not secure. In the words of Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. So, government is taken on as an answer. Why is government the answer? Well, government is the answer because it seeks to provide a way to deter violence, to deter theft of property, to deter assaults on people in a given government. They seek to deter that violence, not prevent it absolutely, because we all know that even in a very civilized society like the United States or like the rule of law governments in Eastern Europe, or in Western Europe, that in those places there are still murders that take place. It is not an absolute guarantee. But government seeks to maintain order, to prevent murder, to prevent theft, to prevent assaults, by coercing. It makes the threat that if you engage in those unacceptable behaviors, that they will seek to arrest you, to try you, to convict you, to punish you in some way for violating these critical laws. And the knowledge that they will do so, and that they have a reasonable chance of carrying out the threat they make, is what makes government a deterrent to violence. So government in its very nature is coercive. All governments are coercive. Our government is coercive. It couldn't be otherwise. It couldn't do its job of protecting us while we're asleep if we're not there saying, we've got policemen on duty around the clock. While they won't catch everybody, they'll catch enough people so that most other people are deterred from engaging in unacceptable behavior. And during those times when there is civil disorder, when there are riots or rebellions or even revolutions, well, it's government that's failed. It's government that can't deter any longer, and that's what makes it a failed government. But for successful governments, it is their fact that they are coercive that makes it possible for them to deter violence, theft, assaults, and all of the other criminal behaviors that are a part of our criminal code. So, if they are going to be coercive, they need certain things. They need to have a police force to maintain order within collections of people, towns, cities, counties, states. But they also need an armed force to protect the nation as a whole from any outside group that might seek to attack the United States. So, a coercive government needs an army. It needs a police force. And if it needs an army and a police force, well, it has to pay for it. And how will it pay for it? Taxes. It's not an accident that there's this old saying, the only thing that's certain about life are death and taxes, because those two things are clearly linked. If you want to have a system that prevents unnatural early deaths, you're going to have a system that imposes taxes. So, government is coercive when it seeks to maintain order against violent people. Government is also coercive when it imposes taxes. Taxes are not passing the offering plate in church. They are not a collection for the United Fund. They are mandatory. Go to the store and you see a package of gum for sale for about 99 cents. You say, I'll take one of those. You go up to the counter, you lay down $1, and you say, here, clerk, I'm in a generous mood, keep the change. The clerk says, wait a minute, you have to pay the tax on that. We have here in Chattanooga, Hamilton County, and in the state of Tennessee, a tax that comes in at about 9.5 cents. Oh, so you owe them another 9 cents, a minimum, in order to get the package of gum. You may not be arrested if you lay down the $1 and walk out the door without paying the tax, but you could be, because you have in fact engaged in shoplifting. You've stolen a certain amount of money from that company by taking something, paying for the set amount or price on the item, and then not paying the tax. So taxes are coercive. Taxes, though, are not enough. We happen to live in a society that believes it's capable of having all of the armed forces it needs, simply by imposing taxes and then paying the members of the armed services. But if we were in a very serious war where we needed a lot of personnel and we needed more people to be in the armed forces than we could pay for, and in a wartime you'd have people say, I'm not going to take that job at any price. In those circumstances, our government will impose a draft. Today, we have a requirement for young men between 18 and 26 that they register with the post office. They're not being drafted. We don't have a draft right now. But their names are being supplied so that if a draft were necessary, a list of them would be available to be drafted. The draft is also a form of coercion, and it's related to the need to provide for our common defense. But that's not the end of it. We think of the government as a great protector of private property. In our society, where we say we have a free enterprise system, a capitalist system if you like, we say that private property is sacred. You own a piece of property, it's yours. Really? Well, not quite. Actually, if you own a piece of property, you own a house and a lot, you have no mortgage on it, so you don't owe the bank anything. You've paid all your property taxes, so you're up to date. And you don't have any liens from any workmen or anything like that. You owe no money. It's your house. You can keep it. And the government can't take it away from you. Yeah, they can't. Unless they proceed through something called eminent domain. Unless they condemn your property because they need it for a public purpose. That may not be a comfortable thought for you, but it's a true thought. Eminent domain is a reality in the United States. And there are certain pieces of property, critical peninsulas, strategically located islands, that are necessary, or the government believes are necessary for its defense. And they may take it. Now they're going to pay for it, but what price are they going to pay for it? They may try to negotiate a selling price with you, but if you and the government cannot agree, if there is no willing seller and no willing buyer, then condemnation proceedings are possible. And you don't really have free enterprise or a capitalist system if you don't have a willing seller and a willing buyer. That's what you don't have if eminent domain and condemnation proceedings are necessary. It is true in America that we have protections under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution that guarantee that a court has to make the decision. But even a court's an arm of the government, so you can't say that there's not something coercive about the whole apparatus. Now, all of this may seem natural, related to the national defense, the need for taxes, the need for a draft, eminent domain to get critical pieces of property for national defense. All of that may seem clearly related to the government's fundamental role. But that's not the end of the coercion. No. Government is coercive in almost everything it does, even if it's providing welfare benefits of one kind or another. If you're watching this video, you're likely to be in my class. At the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. If you're in that class, there's a fairly good chance that you may be there only because you can pay for it through a Pell Grant or through some kind of federally subsidized loan. That is arguably a kind of welfare benefit that you're being provided by the government. Did it come without strings attached? Oh, no, I don't think so. In fact, you have an obligation to pay it back, and the government can take certain steps against you if you don't pay it back. That's not, and they're stronger than any bank that might lend you money because they are backed up by the coercive power of the government. Government is everywhere. Government is coercive. All governments are coercive. Even our government is coercive. Now that's harsh, and we don't like to think of ourselves as living under a government that's coercive in that way. But it is coercive in that way. Another way of expressing it is to say, all governments, including our government, claim to have a legal monopoly on the use of lethal force. Now, you don't have very many politicians running for public office saying, please elect me governor, or please elect me president, or please elect me mayor, because I want to have access to the legal monopoly on the use of lethal force. But in fact, the reality is for all of those offices and a good many others, that is the reality, that that's what government does. So, why are we in this situation? Well, part of it is that we're afraid of random violence. We're afraid of random violence by people who live near us, individuals who might strike at us while we're asleep. We're also fearful of outside forces against us that might damage us at some point. So that's also a real threat to us. We are anxious and concerned about that. But this raises another question. We've created government to try to avoid threats to ourselves. But what if we create this thing called government and it turns against us? This was a very real threat for Thomas Hobbes when he wrote his book, The Leviathan. On the frontispiece, the opening sheet that's in the front of every book that sort of tells you what the book is about, on the frontispiece of his book, he had a picture of a European walled city. He wrote about 300-400 years ago, so walled cities existed. He has a giant there. He has a giant there, but the giant is a figure made up of what looks like chainmail, except if you look very carefully, each of the elements of the chainmail are little human beings. We have created government out of human beings to protect human beings. The question is always, can we balance it in such a way that we can protect ourselves from great harm without having the thing we've created to protect ourselves harm us even worse?